It's a good question, and it's puzzling in certain respects, because, as I say, historically we know that this was certainly not the case, and that quite explicitly from the 17th century to the 19th century, most people involved in the sciences were very sympathetic to religion. Things changed, I think, in the 19th century in this country, in the UK, partly because I think for professional reasons, that in a sense in the 19th century science came into existence as a profession, as something that could be government funded, and in order for science to come of age as an independent activity, some of its proponents wanted to set up for their own purposes a conflict between science and religion. Part of this was because the university establishment was dominated by clerical interests, again in this country. So it became necessary at a professional level to distinguish the profession of science from the clerical religious profession. And so people like Thomas Huxley quite explicitly used Darwinian theory as a way to make science a unique profession that was something quite different from the clerical profession, and he was very successful in doing that. Now, at the same time, I think there were a couple of other developments that were important. There was a notion of progress, and this was most obvious in the philosophy of Auguste Comte, who argued that society moves through successive stages from the religious stage ultimately to the scientific stage. So the progressive understanding of certain philosophers in the 19th century was that theology was a phase through which society moved to a more elevated scientific phase. And so science was naturally seen as the rational activity that would, in any civilised society, supplant theology and mythology. And then the final element, I think, was people actually constructing history of the science for the first time and picking up on episodes like the Galileo episode, which, as I've said before, does seem to be an instance of a conflict between science and religion, and arguing that these specific instances typified the whole historical relation of science and religion. And I think we can add to the Galileo episode the reactions to Darwin. We know that religious reactions to Darwin were not uniformly negative, and that Darwinism was welcomed by a number of important religious figures. But certain religious reactions against Darwinism made it possible for the publication of The Origin also to be constructed as an instance of science versus religion conflict. So to sum up, the answers to the question, it's a very complex question, but there are a number of components to it. The idea that society was coming of age and that it was outgrowing its religious roots and it was becoming more sophisticated and scientific. The professional necessity for scientists to distinguish themselves from the clergy, and then finally the construction of the history of science that tended to blow up instances of conflict between science and religion and argue that these typified the whole relation between science and religion.